All right, guys. This will be a quick tip video, so I'll try to get straight to the point without wasting time. I'm going to explore some techniques for filling an object with a steady liquid volume that maintains its level and doesn't overflow, even when additional liquid is added from other sources. It won't drain out once the emission stops. Also, a method for instantly filling a river so you don't have to wait for the water to travel from one end to the other, potentially reducing the number of pre-roll frames needed. In Phoenix, whenever you want to instantly fill something with liquid, whether it's an object or a grid, you have a couple of options. For an object, you can use the Initial Liquid Fill option, located in the Phoenix properties, for that specific object. If you're filling the grid, there's an Initial Fill Up checkbox in the Dynamics rollout of the simulation. This option fills the grid based on a percentage of the grid's height. The default is 50%. When enabled, half of the grid is filled, and the water starts falling due to gravity, eventually leaving the grid's borders and disappearing. You can either create some geometry to hold the water inside, or block the grid borders, making them act like solid walls. If you create a Phoenix source that emits more water into the grid, the water level will naturally rise. When the emission stops, you'll end up with more liquid than the initial 50%. If that's not what you want, you can create a second source with a negative emission value to absorb or drain the excess liquid instead. This is a standard workflow and is used often in different setups. However, it requires some balancing between the amount emitted and the amount absorbed. Plus, it can create some movement of the water that may or may not be desirable. An additional option becomes available when initial fill-up is enabled. It's called Fill Up for Ocean. As the name suggests, it's meant for large-scale ocean simulations. But that doesn't mean we can't use it in some other way. Let's see how it works and what it does exactly. If I enable it and start the simulation again, it might seem like nothing has changed. Half of the grid is still filled with liquid, just like before. If I enable the additional source, the simulation container will hold the extra water coming in, and the level will start to rise again. This is because the Fill Up for Ocean option requires all of the container walls to be open to function properly. By unblocking them, Phoenix will treat the simulation grid as part of an infinite ocean. It will instantly fill to whatever percentage value you've entered, and the water won't spill to the sides or fall through the bottom, despite the fact that the walls are now open. But now, no matter how much extra water is emitted or absorbed by additional Phoenix sources, the ocean level won't change. Sure, it might create some ripples, but the overall amount of water will stay the same. All right, so that's that. Now, let's see what happens if I add some geometry with walls and a bottom. This geometry is a solid object, so Phoenix won't create any liquid particles inside the walls, but it will fill the inside and outside of the bowl. If I unhide the source, any liquid that ends up in the bowl will stay there, and it will accumulate. Once it's filled to the top, the water will spill over the edge into the endless and bottomless ocean. And again, this won't change the ocean level. All right, if I stop the simulation and move the object down, like this, and start over the sim, all the water that pours into the bowl won't affect the ocean level. Let me just lower the initial level a bit so it is easier to see. The object still has a bottom, but it's outside the grid, so Phoenix doesn't know about it. What it sees instead is the bottom border of the grid, which acts as a portal to the infinite ocean depths. Or you can simply drill a hole at the bottom, opening a connection to the endless void. This doesn't have to be your render geometry, the one that's visible in the final image. You can do this with a non-renderable object, used as a simulation collider. Preparing simplified, clean proxies for the simulation is always a smart choice. Yeah, I know it's extra work. I don't even do it all the time. But working inside a simplified, clean scene is the wise thing to do. In this render, you can see the geometry used for the final beauty render and the one used for the simulation, the one with the hole at the bottom. You don't need to remove the entire bottom. Drilling a small hole should be enough. But wait, how do you get rid of the liquid outside the basin while keeping what's inside? Well, you can always modify the collider further by extending its walls beyond the grid's borders. This should clean up all the unnecessary particles. You can also narrow the grid, since there's no need to have so many empty voxels. And that's pretty much all you need to know about the fill up for ocean option and how to take advantage of the fact that the ocean maintains its level, no matter what. Oh, one more thing. If you use a collider wide enough to clear the particles outside, any water droplets that splash over the edge will slide across the surface instead of falling to the ground. So try to avoid that. Of course, if that does happen, or if that's the effect you're going for, you can always capture those droplets in a second, cascaded simulation that has its own ocean level. I might dive into this kind of setup in a future video, but for now, let's keep this one short. Here's another example. This is a simplified riverbed model with some rocks scattered here and there. Normally, you'd place an emitter at one end and use surface force emission from one of the faces. In this case, the face has ID 2, and that's where the source is set to emit from. When you run the simulation, you have to wait for the water to reach the other end. And how long does that take? 120? 130 frames? Right. But let's try something different. Hide the source, enable the ocean fill-up, and maybe move the container slightly so that part of the bottom has no geometry underneath. If you run the simulation now, the water will constantly spring from the bottom as well as from the left wall. Both will maintain a constant water level. As the water accumulates on the geometry, it will eventually start sliding and flowing down the surface. However, on the lower end of the river, there's another container wall that's also keeping the water level steady, which might disrupt the flow. Let me unhide this box to make it easier to see. The box is set to non-solid and has the clear inside option enabled, which is supposed to clear all liquid that enters it. But not quite. There's a thin layer of particles sitting on the container wall. These particles are created by the ocean fill, and they can't be easily deleted. If I hide the box, that wall will resume pouring liquid in the opposite direction. That's a bit of a bummer, but we can easily fix it by rotating the entire container, let's say by 5 degrees. There's no rule that says the ocean level has to be perfectly horizontal. By tilting it, the container wall at the end of the stream will be at a lower level than the one at the start, which will help the flow. Unfortunately, you'll still have to wait a bit for the water to pick up speed and start flowing. But this usually happens much faster than waiting for it to travel the entire distance, especially if the river is much longer than this one. And there it is. Of course, this technique works best on flat rivers. If there are waterfalls or cascades, you may need to use the traditional approach or build the cascades with sequenced simulations, similar to what I did with the fountain. And that's it. I hope you find these tips helpful. I'm planning to start a quick tip series and share other small tricks like these, as well as workflow tips like how to retime your simulations, how to re-simulate, and anything else I find interesting or useful. So let me know in the comments if there's something specific you want to learn about. And if you don't want to miss anything, consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon or whatever. I'm not entirely sure how that works, but I guess you'll get a notification or something. All right, take care and goodbye.